those like robot cameras? Is there someone in the back directing the camera?
There is, yeah. And there's a little. No. You're on the internet, Rusty. Yeah. All right, why don't we get started? Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here. I'm Yuval Levin. I'm director of the new research division on social, cultural, and constitutional studies here at AEI, and the editor of National Affairs magazine, which has newly made its home here at AEI. We're very grateful for that. This issue of National Affairs, the fall 2019 issue, is the 10th anniversary issue of the magazine. And to mark that occasion, we thought that rather than talk about ourselves, we would call upon some friends to reflect on the state of the business we're in, the state of journals of ideas, of political and policy magazines, and especially the state of the magazines of the American right. Intellectual journalism may be in some ways most associated with radical politics, maybe even with radical European politics, but actually magazines have always had an important role in American intellectual and political life. We've called this event tonight the Conservative Magazine in America as a reference to a not at all famous essay of Thomas Paine's in 1775 called The Magazine in America, in which he makes the argument that opinion journalism would actually be particularly important in this society, which doesn't come equipped with a homegrown intellectual aristocracy. And in some ways, that has turned out to be true over our history. And journals of opinion have actually had a particularly outsized role in the modern history of the American right. The modern conservative movement, in some ways, traces its origins to the birth of a magazine, National Review magazine. It's had some of its most important arguments with itself and with the left in the pages of journals of opinion, including Commentary and First Things, among others. It's made some of its most important contributions, like its core criticism of the Great Society, for example, or the case for rolling back the Soviet Union, or for broken windows policing and welfare reform in the pages of journals of opinion, like Commentary and The Public Interest and others over the years. Well before those arguments were made by politicians, you could find them in the pages of the right's magazines. And, of course, this is also a, shall we say, interesting, unusual time in our politics and in the politics of the American right, a time when a lot of internal debates are happening, when some fundamental questions are on the table. And so it should be a time in which journals of ideas can really thrive, though it's also a time of real confusion and also a moment when the business of magazines finds itself in a complicated situation. And so it's a time that at least calls on us to really think about the purpose of the work of the business we're in, the purpose of magazines and journals of opinion, and the purpose of those on the right in particular. To think about those questions, to benefit from the experience of people who have to live out those questions in their work day to day, we've invited the editors of a couple of the great magazines of the American right to come and help us think. There are many to choose from, but our three guests here bring an enormous amount of expertise, experience, and wisdom on these questions, and also some distinct vantage points on these questions. So let me just introduce them to you a little bit, as if they need an introduction in front of this kind of audience. We'll chat a little bit, and then they'll also take your questions, and we'll think together a bit. Rich Lowry, right next to me here, is the editor of National Review, maybe the flagship magazine of American conservatism. He's edited National Review since 1997. Rich is also a columnist and an author. In fact, his newest book, The Case for Nationalism, will be published next month. John Podhoretz, at the end, is the editor of Commentary magazine, the 70-something-year-old journal of opinion and ideas, which has been home to some of the most significant intellectual journalism in modern American history and continues to be. John has edited Commentary since 2009, and he brings a lot more experience than that. He was one of the founders of the Weekly Standard. He's a columnist and critic and author. He's worked as both a news editor and an opinion editor over the years at many journalistic outfits, and so has seen the world of intellectual journalism from lots of angles for a long time. And Rusty Reno is the editor of First Things, a journal of religion and public life that's long been an intellectual hub for religious and social conservatives, and that's been at the center of a lot of the internal debates of the American right in the last few years. Rusty has edited First Things since 2011. He's been a writer, a theologian, academic, and author. And his newest book, The Return of the Strong Gods, will be published later this month, I think next week, in fact. Thank you, all three of you, for being here. There are a lot of places we could start, but we are in Washington, and we are talking about conservative journalism. And so maybe we ought to start with the elephant in every room around here and think a little bit about the Trump moment, and then broaden out from there to some actually interesting subjects and ways of thinking about the work you all do. But maybe the place to begin really is to think about what the purpose is of a conservative magazine in this period. What is the purpose of opinion journalism on the right now, and what is it like to edit a conservative magazine? Rich, what is it like running the flagship journal of the American right in a moment when the American right is in such flux?
Oh, it's great. It's great, Yuval. Thanks for asking.
It looks like a whole lot of fun every day from the outside.
Well, first of all, let me just say it's a pleasure to be here, and 10 years of National Affairs is a wonderful event. Yuval is a modest guy, but the audacity of the project of restarting the public interest in all but name, and to actually pull it off is an extraordinary achievement. So hats off to you, Yuval. And I was thinking about this recently. I think I can claim actually that I've worked for three of the preeminent giants of the American intellectual right. Bill Buckley, obviously, I worked out of school as a research assistant for Charles Krauthammer. And then actually I was a part-time intern during college for the National Interest when the National Interest was housed basically in the same office as the Public Interest. And one day, for what reason, just to expose me to the experience, they had me sit in the Public Interest office at the time, and John, I'm sure you're familiar with this, when they had these sort of school desks, like 4 school desks facing each other. Irving, for some reason, thought this was enhanced thought or intellectual activity, being awkward proximity to people. And he came in that afternoon, and I was terrified he would say something to me. He didn't, but he listened to a Baltimore Orioles game on the radio and shuffled around some newspapers. And then subsequently, I got a job offer, a job in Wisconsin, and someone thought it'd be great if I asked Irving for advice and hooked me up with him, and showing the great intellectual confidence of such an intellect. He told me in no uncertain terms, knowing nothing about me or my personal circumstances, that I should immediately get married and move to Milwaukee. Advice I didn't take. But so finally, I think everyone's going to leave this room disappointed if we don't find out the question we're all wondering is whether John Podhoretz spends more or less time on Twitter now that he's officially off Twitter. But I think it's an interesting and challenging time, and I mean there are a lot of people who now just say magazines like this don't matter. I think it's notable to me that a lot of people who tell me National Review doesn't matter, they'll say National Review doesn't matter, and by the way, in the second sentence of the 5th paragraph of this piece, there is this line I disagree with, and it's an outrage that you published it. But I think there are new aspects of our environment. One is a traditional role of National Review was establishing the boundaries of what was a respectable conservative opinion and respectable conservative figures, and that boundary has just now been totally wiped out and effaced, largely by technological innovations. If you take Milo Yiannopoulos, for instance, we always thought he was a disreputable fraud. We never would have published him, but we could say he's a disreputable fraud over and over again. It would make no difference as long as he had 1 million Twitter followers. And Jack Dorsey had more of an impact on whether Milo Yiannopoulos had an audience or not than National Review did. And that wouldn't have been the case 30 years ago. And sort of my darker thoughts are that we had the story about Ronald Reagan, who was this figure kind of made in part by the conservative intellectual world that fed him these ideas, and in my lower moments, I think, no, actually, Reagan could have never read commentary or National Review or anything else, and just say, look, I'm a really good-looking guy, I'm a winner, I hire the best people, and I'm going to win for America, and it all would have rolled out the same, that he didn't need us. He needed the charisma and the personality and the ability to make an emotional appeal to people. Now, I think that's too dark a view. I think we've seen it played out with President Trump, where a lot of times during the primaries, I'd look at my bookshelves groaning under various conservative volumes and say, what is any of this for? This guy is just conquering the Republican Party through sheer force of personality. But then, once he's in office, the domestic agenda is largely an orthodox Republican one, for better or worse. The judges are exemplary, and that's because all the thought had happened over the course of decades, whether it was tax reform or regulation, deregulation, or what the Federal Society has done advancing the cause of originalism and actually advancing conservative talent. So it's not as dire as I think in my more down moments, but it is definitely a completely different environment.
Not as dire as it could possibly be. That's good. John, do you think about this moment differently? I have to say, as a reader of commentary, it doesn't seem like commentary's basic attitude has changed in the Trump era from before.
I was thinking, as Rich was talking about, what is this for, of that story about Kissinger and Leduc-Taux talking about the French Revolution, when Leduc-Taux said, we still don't know.
Yeah, too soon to say.
Too soon to say whether it succeeded or failed. The intellectual project of conservatism is often mistaken, and particularly in Washington, for partisan victories by the Republican Party. Commentary like First Things, I believe, I'm pretty sure, is a 501c3 nonprofit, and so by the rules governing such bodies, we do not endorse candidates, and we cannot be we are not, our purpose cannot be to, advance specific policies to aid one party's standing or another. That proved in marketing terms during the Obama years a problem for commentary, because we couldn't write the direct mail packages to get subscribers that would say, read this to know how to defeat Obama. Read this to know how to get a Republican Congress. Read this to know how, what you need to do. The insider's view of Washington, that kind of thing. And that was a problem during Obama, and I think was something that, say, Rich and National Review and the Weekly Standard, other places, benefited from not being nonprofits, that they could promise readers that their subscriptions and their readership were part of an overall political partisan mission. I think we have benefited in the Trump years from the fact that we keep our arm's length from such matters, and that has kept me as an editor just looking beyond the horizon. And there are a bunch of people in this room, including Yuval. Yuval has written a couple of very important pieces for commentary during my editorship. And mostly what those are, and mostly what I feel my magazine is best at, is analyzing a problem. Not providing a solution to the problem, because, to be honest, modesty makes it necessary to say that one doesn't necessarily have a solution to the problem. But if you can get people to accept that a problem exists, that in and of itself can have very profound consequences in the general tenor of the discussions of issues of the day. So Yuval's wrote a piece for me, I think 5 years ago, or 4 years, called The Mobility Crisis, in which the initial idea was to talk about how, we were going to blend both the fact that people weren't moving through the economic quintiles as quickly or as easily as they used to, but it kind of got more focused on the fact that people literally weren't moving as much, and that the physical fact that people found it difficult to relocate to better their circumstances represented an almost unique phenomenon in American history, and that it was important to look at this and see, were there things that needed to be done at a public policy level to see if there were things that were hindering this, unanticipated consequences of other policies, because clearly this meant that people were not able to better their circumstances in the way that they used to. The article that had the most readership and made the most impact in the course of my 10 years of my editorship was AEI scholar Nick Eberstadt's piece we called Our Miserable 21st Century, which really brought together all of the sociological data that everybody now takes for granted about the deaths from the opioid crisis, the rising suicide crisis in general, adding to the lack of mobility, stuff about young men without college educations and how their lives were ending up completely static and unmoving. And again, that piece, people would complain to me occasionally because it ends. It says, here's the problem. But honestly, I don't know, and I don't think I think it would be foolish or impertinent if you don't really have a solution to just tack on a solution because that's how the thing should end. You got to give people, a satisfying, capper so that they can go home feeling happy and rest and not be too bothered by it. And I think that's part of how I view my editorship, is trying to define the problems, and there are problems. There were Obama-era problems, and there are Trump-era problems, and there will be problems that follow whenever the Trump era ends, and that is a very important intellectual exercise. Ultimately, the only thing that an analyst can do with real authority is gather information and present it in the most authoritative way. And so I feel somewhat liberated, in an odd way. I feel somewhat liberated by the fact that we have, for all sorts of reasons, and some obvious, keeping an arm's length from the Trump administration and Trump and the people who work for Trump and all of that, in part because I think that is one of the weak sicknesses of the moment, is this idea that you say, this is terrible, we shouldn't, too many wars, so we're out of Syria. Okay, good. And then fantastic, that's wonderful. And then we can move on to another problem, and that this is a weakness of the moment, and that's a weakness that we are compelled to avoid by the nature of our existence.
Rusty, First Things has leaned in more to the internal debates of the right, has taken this moment as a different moment, and seems to have maybe more of a political character or more of an interest in the ways that political questions relate to the kinds of deeper cultural and religious questions that have always been its subject. How conscious has that been? Has that been driven by you as an editor? Has it been where your writers have wanted to go? Is it where your readers want to go?
Well, I think the last 3 years raise a question. Are we in a period of flux and readjustment, or are we in a kind of what I would call an axial moment, a moment of really deep redefinition, of a deep reconsideration of what the problems are facing our country, and then a consequently deep reconsideration of what it means to respond to those problems from a conservative perspective. I'm very clear in my own mind that it's an axial moment and not a readjustment. So you're correct, I have leaned in, and it certainly has been, and I've been pushing writers to write about things that I think need to be written about. Getting Chris Caldwell to write about the heroin overdose death, and getting Dan McCarthy to write about a new economic agenda for the American right, and to get Saurabh Ahmari to write about the problems with
David French.
You got it. So, why do I think that? The kind of one of the eye-opening moments for me was At the Republican National Convention, Ted Cruz gave a convention speech that must have used the word freedom 100 times. I mean, it was Reaganism on steroids. And that's the traditional language of Bill Buckley and I think the American right. And Trump used his convention speech, I doubt he used the word freedom a single time in his convention speech. And his themes are ones of protection and solidarity, I would say. And so I think, to me, this helped me. I had some intuitions coming into 2016, but it clarified for me that we have a situation where voters, on the right certainly, are increasingly unhappy with a deregulatory agenda, an economic deregulatory agenda that has led to prosperity for the very top end of society and wage stagnation for people in the middle. And they're also unhappy with the cultural deregulation, which has led to, exactly as John pointed out in that great essay by Nick Eberstadt, to a miserable 2 decades for people with high school educations. So it seems to me that seeing that as the problem, that our political agenda going forward cannot be the same as what it was a generation ago, when we had different kinds of problems as a country. You know, in 1970, our economy was faltering. We couldn't build cars that could compete against the Japanese. And I think an economic deregulatory agenda made a great deal of sense. In 2019, it's not clear to me that it makes sense. I think that we need to reconsolidate our economy in a way that allows for wage growth for high school educated Americans. And I think we need a politics of what I would call cultural solidarity, and that involves renewing and revitalizing our civic and patriotic language and vocabulary. And I think it also means having some courage in the political world to speak up for kind of ordinary human needs like marriage, family. I think it's a scandal that we have an unregulated pornography regime in the United States. I've become radicalized, I think, in the last 3 years. I mean, again, to that great piece by Nick Eberstadt, it is damning statistics because we created the society that is immiserating these people. And there is no contrition in our society among the leadership class. And until there is contrition and a willingness to rethink priorities, I think that the voters are going to be very truculent and very volatile. And they're going to find someone who's willing to address these problems, which are not the problems of a generation or two ago.
So I feel like nothing that you said seems remotely controversial to me, or does reflect some kind of a break on the right. The problems of social dissolution have been a topic of concern to precisely these magazines, including National Review from the start and Commentary as it became a neoconservative publication in the 1970s, and National Affairs and its progenitors, which were very much focused on these matters. I think something happened. There was a discontinuity that happened that makes Rusty's project difficult, which is that most of the problems that were public policy problems that resulted from the difficulties in the 1970s and the 1980s were expressed in terms of crime. It's very hard for young people in this room to understand how central crime was as a fact of American life. It was the central fact of American domestic life, the central fact, not tax cuts, not the environment, not anything anybody talks about now, particularly if you lived in cities, but not only if you lived in cities. Crime was viewed by serious people and not by people who sought to apologize for it as the result of these of a series of social deformities that needed to be addressed. Just as the unanticipated collapse of the Soviet Union has thrown our understanding of what our national mission or national purpose is in the world into chaos, oddly enough, the fact that America was saved from violent crime in the 1990s, we can discuss why or how or what happened, but the fact that it has lasted almost as long now as the crime wave itself, which we can attribute to 1964. That's the year when crime started to spike and for 30 years remained at this horrendous level. And we're now 26 years into its diminution. And the right doesn't understand what to do with the knowledge that it has about the social problems that are caused by the lack of solidarity, the difficulties in people of middle income making a better living for themselves. And it's an interesting, as a thought experiment, it's interesting because we should be better, right? I mean, tens of thousands of people are alive today who would have been killed, who would be dead. Hundreds of thousands, maybe. I mean, it's hard to know. Or tens of thousands are living, and several and their offspring now exist who would never have lived, and all of that. And yet, we, just as with the foreign policy problems that we face, we don't know what to do with the peace dividend that we got. We got a kind of social peace dividend, and we squandered it in some fashion. I mean, and part of it was squandered because when we really needed to deal with it, 9/11 happened and refocused us for a decade. And then the financial meltdown happened and refocused us away from this question of how are we going to. So I'm just saying, as a topic of discussion, it's not as though the sorts of things that you are focusing on have not been the central domestic concern of conservative publications, because none of our publications is libertarian. We don't, I don't think anybody here, was Irving Kristol's book was called 2 Cheers for Capitalism, not 3 Cheers for Capitalism. And, throughout the 1980s, magazine like Commentary excoriated American capitalists for doing what the NBA just did last night with China. I mean, that was something that was done, Citibank tried to get the federal government to pay Citibank money because we put the grain embargo on the Soviet Union after the invasion of Afghanistan, claiming that Citibank needed to be made whole because it had made a deal with the it had made deals with the Eastern Bloc. That was the sort of thing that we dealt with, and that was sort of John Reed. He was not Walter Wriston. They weren't, Walter Wriston was a great hero of the Manhattan Institute. So there was a real sense that there was something more important than the free market or capitalism or, global capitalism from the outset.
Rich, what do you make of that point, of John's case, that the argument that Rusty makes and that you hear made a lot, that conservatism needs to free itself from the grip of libertarianism, mistakes the history it's trying to describe. It's in a sense a critique of National Review conservatism in some ways, right? Implicit in a lot of these arguments is a sense that for a long time the right has just rented out its thinking to the simplest kinds of libertarians.
Well, Reagan said in the first inaugural address, at this moment, government is the problem. And I would say at that moment it was in a variety of ways. Now, to Rusty's other points, National Review, we said for a long time, for years predating Trump, that we just can't fall back on a warmed-over Reaganism. Like, circumstances change, and how you engage with new problems should change as well. And even during the primaries, when I thought there was a chance to stop Trump, you can see there's an issue about that, an issue of National Review.
I was thinking of bringing that up, Rich.
Yeah, even if we stopped him, he was obviously potent, And we need to learn from it and not just snap back, to Republican orthodoxy circa 2004. Whatever happens with Trump, whether he's a two-term president or whether he falls flat in 2020, what comes next has to learn from him and just can't reject root and branch Trumpism, in my view. I guess the problems I have is the people who seem most fervent about engaging in theory with problems of the working class and rejecting a warmed-over Reaganism seem least interested in giving us any specifics about how we're going to do this, which seems really important. And I'm open, in theory, to all sorts of policies to do this, whether it's enhanced apprenticeships or changing how we do high school and more vocational education, even wage subsidies. But the debate often, it's very ethereal and kind of interesting at a certain level, but lacks concrete expression. And then there's a tendency, I think, on the part of some national conservatives or more a populist nationalist to just believe that all conservatives did for the last 40 years is just surrender on everything and fail on every single front. Whereas John points out, tremendous victory on crime, we won the Cold War, forged an energy revolution, excavated the true meaning of the Second Amendment, but just got wiped out in terms of the culture. And if you can tell me what we could have done to stop the dissolution of the family or the tide of porn, which anguished Bill Buckley, which we invade against probably in every other issue of National Review, I'd love to know what that magic bullet is. And if we can find that magic bullet now to reverse all of it, I'm on board, and I'll holster up and take that ammunition. It's just I have never heard what that bullet is.
Rusty?
We have an article in the current
bullet?
First Things on how to regulate pornography. Specifics. I think we have a larger structural problem. I mean, yes, we've lost the culture, but if you look at the 100 largest foundations in America, it's probably 90-10 progressive, and it's not just that they don't agree with me. They are now supersized, so we outsource our educational policy to the Gates Foundation. And so I propose a $1 billion cap, lifetime cap on charitable contributions. So there's a proposal. And there's a kind of anxiety in the room. Well, whoa, wait a minute. That's violating free market, that's a tax. And violating free market principles, but tax policy is social policy. If you want billionaires to run your country, then you give them huge tax incentives to fund private forms of government. And I think this is a serious problem, and we need to address it with very specific targeted policies. I think that the tax on supersized university endowments, which is in the 2017 tax bill, is very, very small, needs to be increased. It is a scandal that we as taxpayers are subsidizing education of not just super talented Americans that are going to prosper in the global economy, but we're subsidizing the education of all kinds of foreign students through our tax policies. I think these sorts of specific things. I think we should have. States should consider taxing divorce. We have sin taxes on cigarettes and alcohol. We know that divorce is damaging to children. I don't want to go back to the old days and I think it was unreasonable, but I think we should tax divorce at 10% of net worth for every couple whose net worth is more than $1 million excluding their home. And I think that would get people's attention. It wouldn't affect a whole lot of people, but the law is a teacher. And if you pass such a law, it has an effect. And so I'm not a policy guy. These are things I think about in the shower. I'm just a broken down theology professor. But my observation is that we on the right have been in the grip of a catechism that has limited our ability to think creatively about how to engage in the art of politics in order to try to fashion a way forward in the 21st century where the problems that we face are just so different from the problems of the 1980s, when we could take for granted the intact middle-class family,
I don't think anyone took for granted the intact middle-class family in the 1980s, and they shouldn't have, because the middle-class family was not intact in the 1980s. I mean, I think part of the problem here is there has been an immense amount of creative thinking on some of the sorts of things that you discuss. I see Paul Ryan is here, and he spent a great deal of time trying to figure out how to deal with spend a career trying to deal with the entitlement disincentives and distortions, and we have little bits and pieces of it that came out in the tax bill in 2017, efforts to figure out something to do about the, what is arguably the worst piece, the worst unanticipated piece of public policy of the post-war, or two pieces of the post-war era, one being the granting of the tax deduction for healthcare to businesses rather than to individuals, and the other being the mortgage interest deduction, which has been a distortive fact now for half a century and is incredibly difficult, or 60 years, incredibly difficult to deal with, simply because you're talking about precisely if you deal with it in a way that would creatively reset the American economy in a more rational frame for the purposes of making housing more affordable for a lot of people. You're also talking about wiping out 20 to 30 to 40% of the net worth of tens of millions of households. These are fiendishly difficult problems, and I think there are demonstration projects that can be done. And this is, by the way, one of the glories of the public interest and national affairs following on the public interest was precisely working on the sorts of things that I don't do, like working on policy thought experiments or suggesting what might be attempted that could prove a laboratory case to go further with something. Now, having said all this, I think we also, there is the danger in this case of throwing out the baby with the bathwater. You say that the tax, like limiting billionaires' charitable giving to $1 billion is seen as an affront on the free market. I don't see it as an affront on the free market. I see it as an affront on free speech, among other things. And I see it also as the idea that it's a very issue that is very near and dear to my heart, and should be near and dear to your heart, given that we rely on charitable, and for everybody in this room, given that we rely on charitable contributions to function. But that the whole point about the charitable contribution is that when you give $1, it is the left that seems to think that the dollar naturally belongs to the government, and therefore you're giving somebody a tax break by giving them 35 cents back from that dollar. But that means they're spending 65 cents they don't have to spend otherwise to give the money away to somebody else. Now, we may not like where they're giving it, but and I agree with you. I don't like the fact that it's all these liberal foundations who get so much of this money, but that is where we live in a society in which I don't want you to be dictating that they're bad, just as I don't want them to be dictating that my foundations are bad.
It's a tribute to Yuval and National Affairs that you can start a conversation about Conservative Magazine, a seminar about charitable giving and tax policy.
It happens naturally, right? But, one of the...
But it's not an insignificant problem. It's going to have a massively distorting effect on our foreign policy. Our tax policy funds... our tax policy allows the American nonprofit foundations to have a huge impact globally. I think it's going to lead to serious distorting effects on our foreign policy. The Gates Foundation effectively runs health policy for most of Africa. And people say, well, they do a better job than the governments of those countries would. But at some point I say, fuck you. I want to run my own goddamn country.
Whether it's this kind of idea or another, the place of opinion journalism surely is in trying to move public opinion at some level, right? And moving the culture to a place where it would accept some of the ideas we think might help. And I wonder how you think about the role of the magazines you run in shaping public opinion. Rich, you brought up the Against Trump issue, which I assume was intended to move public opinion. Oddly, all four of us were involved in that issue. You were the editor of it, but you asked the three of us, among others, to...
Oh, yes, it's all my fault.
Yeah, exactly. All of us were among the people you invited to explain why Trump was not the right choice in the Republican primary. Tell us a little bit about how you thought about that issue, what its purpose was, what it achieved and didn't achieve, how you thought it would play out in the world and how it has played out in the world as a way of influencing public opinion in a critical moment.
So at that point, you know, we were long beyond like, oh, it's peak Trump phase or, you know, summer phenomenon phase. He's clearly...
this is January of 2016.
Right. And we began formulating in December. And, you know, there wasn't a lot of consolidated sentiment against him. So we thought we would make such a statement and get as wide array as of people as possible, including, you know, from libertarians to social conservatives. And I found in my experience, sort of, it's easier to stop a candidate than to create a candidate. You know, it's easier to be negative than positive. And we ran it about 2 weeks before the Iowa caucuses, thinking that was, you know, the real moment of vulnerability. And if you won Iowa, you know, is all over. If you stopped him in Iowa, you might stop him. He was stopped in Iowa, but it didn't move his numbers in the least in New Hampshire, and it was just, you know, just a powerful phenomenon. At the beginning, you know, plurality phenomenon in the Republican Party, but a really intense one, and then came, you know, through various forces, including just the sheer gravity of partisanship to take over the entire party. To the point now, he has, you know, such a grip on it that he can, you know, literally, he can't do this maybe to Mitt Romney, but he can destroy people's careers with one or two tweets. So we thought that was the best moment to try to stop him, and gave it our best go. And every single media interview I did, it's like, don't know if it's going to work, you know, don't know how it's going to turn out, but we're here to, you know, put down our marker and make a go of it. And I'm really glad I had several opportunities in media appearances to like do a victory lap after Iowa. No, I'm not doing that. There's more of the story here, and we've seen at least 3 years of it play out.
Mm-hmm. I do think it shows that in the ecosystem, in ordinary times, you know, we are reaching a very literate audience, people interested in ideas, thinking about things. And in a populist time, of course, the relationship between leaders and the led breaks down. And so, you know, we can speak to our audience, but our audience was losing the trust of sort of grassroots voters. I think that was an interesting feature of the 2016, how impotent the organs of opinion were in the face of that electoral
like
shift.
a common reaction was, you're telling me what to do, right? You're telling me how to vote. No, this is our opinion. This is just what we think is right. We're not dictating anything to you, but that is how it was received among a lot of people.
Well, so again, making the case for modesty in terms of what these publications are. What is commentary? I'm closing an issue this week. I got to have 5 columns. I got to have 5 articles. I got to have Continetti's got to turn in a column today. Rosen turned in a column Friday. I'm waiting on Mayor Soloveichik, who has to write it before Kol Nidre. I got Rob Long, who's always screwing up his deadline, and he's got to file before I could send to the printer, or I'm going to have to put an ad on the back page. So I've got to fill 56, 64, 72 pages a month. And then we have our website, and I've got to put up 1 or 2 or 3 blog items a day. And what I want to do is publish interesting things that people will find interesting to read, primarily the people who pay to read it, and then maybe some things will be of interest to people who don't pay, and maybe they can be seduced into paying at a later date if they enjoy it. And I put it this way because that's ultimately all a magazine is a collection of articles, and it's anachronistic. Now it really is a kind of anachronism because this is not the way people consume information, where they get a codex, and the idea is that you can read it from beginning to end. You'll have a bit of this, a bit of that. You'll have some foreign policy, you'll have some domestic policy, you might have a piece of fiction, though I've largely stopped publishing fiction. You might have some book reviews on social matters and some literary stuff, and then some, other sorts of things, and that you get this compendium every month, and this is the way that people used to like to understand things.
But do you see yourself leading your readers somewhere, John?
Not
pointing your readers somewhere?
Not really. I mean, I don't think of it that way consciously. What I think is that what I do for a living is think about what sorts of things might be of interest if I commission them today on October 7th to be written by November 1st, to be published in an issue that closes November 10th, that is in their mailbox on November 17th. How can I make sure that the idea that has struck me that morning won't simply be, like something that should have been a blog post that morning because it's evanescent and will be has no real lasting meaning. Mm-hmm. And so that's since that's what I do from morning till night, whereas my readers are, lawyers, bankers, retired executives, whoever they are, that's not what they do. They read the newspaper, they're very literate, they know what's going on in the world, but the synthesizing the information and saying, look, maybe you didn't pay a lot of attention to the New York Times' 1619 project because you were on vacation, but this thing may set the table for the way Americans learn about American history for the next 10 years, and it's really bad. And I'm going to get a very authoritative historian, Bill McClay, to tell you why, so that you will now understand that when your kids or your grandkids come home and say, really, the Pilgrims weren't the beginning of America. The arrival of these indentured servants in Virginia in 1619 was the beginning. You could say, no, that's not true, and I'm going to tell you why. So is that leading them? I don't know if it's leading them. I think it's helping them or sort of being the person they look to get that information collated for them.
But unfortunately, the 1619 Project is like a classic example of the influence of an opinion publication. The opinion publication happens to fashion itself a newspaper, but it is an opinion publication. And that article, that series of articles, a project, it's even for those of us who reject it and its premises and push back, it's sort of changed like the charge in the intellectual atmosphere. And that's sort of the most you can hope for. Now, it has a bigger circulation than we do. It has more cultural power than we do, unfortunately. But that's how opinion journalism works at its most effective.
And they are trying to lead their readers somewhere.
Right, absolutely.
But here's an interesting aspect of this. So this is a real reversal in polarity when it comes to mainstream journalism. So one of my favorite stories in journalism is in 1982, the Washington Post did a gigantic readership survey, spent millions of dollars on it. It was highly secret, stuff leaked out over it. Now you would know what was in it 5 minutes after they finished it, but they kept very close hold on it. And it was very alarming to people because they learned a couple of salient things. Number one, the most read thing in the Washington Post was Walter Scott's Personality Parade, which was in Parade magazine, which was a Sunday supplement the Post didn't even publish itself. That was the most read feature in the Washington Post. And they discovered that 4 to 5% of the readership read the op-ed pages and the editorials. Now, no one had really done this survey, so people who did what we do for a living would walk around thinking that they were the most important people in the city and that if people fell at their feet to know what it was that they had to say about the latest worthwhile Canadian initiative, as as Flora Lewis famously titled one of her columns of the New York Times, and it turned out nobody was reading. Well, not nobody, because obviously important people, leaders were reading, and the Congress was reading, and all of that. So Trump, the current era and the change in the way things work means the New York Times' circulation surge over the last 3 years is entirely the result of opinion. The most read pieces are almost entirely opinion pieces, and it's positioning itself as the liberal avatar, liberal fighter, or the spokesman for truth in the Trump era, which is itself obviously a version of opinion. This was just not true in our lives until now, that you could, that if you sat down and wrote a 750-word column, that 5 million or 10 million people would read it in a couple of days. And so that in itself opens up interesting vistas of opportunity for publications like ours, even though we don't have that audience, and a lot of it is still being built on the backs of the cooking app or the crossword app or whatever. But it's still the case that people are more interested in opinion, or they've lost any sense that there is a boundary between opinion and reporting, which I don't know whether ordinary people really thought about it that much before, but the tone of things, they're perfectly willing to accept a piece of opinion as being factually based, and that's when I get these emails every time saying, "You called yourself a reporter." When I write something somebody doesn't like, why don't you, that's not reporting. And I'm like, I'm not a reporter, But there is no sense of the distinction between the two.
So I want to open things up for questions from the room, but let me ask you one last question that just interests me about the publications that you run. Each of you, in its own way, is running a magazine that is defined by a prior editor. In the cases of National Review and First Things, the founders of these magazines, Bill Buckley and Richard John Newhouse. In the case of Commentary, not quite the founder, but a very long-time editor who was one of the great intellectuals of the last 100 years, and also happens to be your father. How do you live with that legacy? Is it something you think about at all? Is it something you think readers are aware of by this point? And does it affect the decisions you make about the direction of the magazine? Is there a what would Bill Buckley do moment for you when you think about something significant for National Review?
Yeah, we try to do that all the time. With a sense of modesty, because he was incisive and really idiosyncratic mind. So on any given policy question, it's hard to know, or political question, hard to know where he'd come down. But certainly a certain the way we argue, we might fall down in this way, but we really try to take on the best arguments of the other side. We try not just to hurl invective, what Bill would call attitudinizing, which is just pumping up your own side. And while being sharp, and combative, having a baseline of civility and kind of representing what we think is the not just the best substantive conservative arguments, but the best way of representing those arguments. And then personnel things come up and all sorts of institutional questions where you can have a pretty good idea where a bill would be, and we still try to be guided by that to the extent we plausibly can.
Rusty?
Yeah, first I apologize for my spirited nature getting the better of me earlier.
I enjoyed it.
Well,
Yes.
My wife sometimes gets mad at me when
AI
my
needs
spirited
more
nature.
This happens at every AI event, really. Don't worry about it.
This is why I got off Twitter, by the way.
Well, I don't have Twitter, so
You should have
I
heard
need
the
an
Dalai
outlet.
Lama when he dropped his
Yeah.
Newhouse, I knew him quite well. And at the end of the day, First Things' mission is theological. We publish Jews, Protestants, and Catholics, and we're united in the belief that an ever deeper submission to God's will is a fundamentally humanizing enterprise. And I think there's not a scintilla that separates me from him on that point. And around that is what everything else in the magazine revolves around that.
So my father has, I think a lot of people will recognize, if you were to, it's not just that he wrote a book about the prophets, but has about him a hortatory, injunctive seriousness that echoes the Hebrew prophets. That is to say, and I will say this, that he believed when he was editing commentary, and particularly in its most febrile, in its most sort of febrile, but also its most passionate period when it really worked to redefine the way Americans thought about a whole bunch of things. He believed that what he was doing was the most important thing that could be done on this earth, and that therefore every word had to be honed, every syllable had to be burnished, and it was immensely painful for him to publish things with which he disagreed, even in modest ways, because he thought that this was the fight for the soul of Western civilization, and if you relented on one tiny, if you let one thread dangle, someone could pull it, and the whole experiment could go up. So if he's a Hebrew prophet, I'm Mel Brooks. I mean, I wish I were Mel Brooks, but I do not have that same feeling. I've worked at too many different kinds of places in too many different kinds of ways to believe that I speak with that kind of deep authority or lead an institution with that kind of Old Testament authority. But I do think that the treasurer that I was handed, he retired in 1995. There was a 14-year period in which Neil Kozlowy was the editor of the magazine before I became its editor. That was in that period was Lewinsky and 9/11 and Iraq and the meltdown. I mean, it's not as though he really was. His editorship ended pretty much contiguous with the end of the Cold War, and the high watermark of the 90s. The feeling that somehow, we had reached a new kind of world consensus that was very surprising to him. It was surprising that the Soviet Union collapsed. It was surprising that the crime wave ended. All of that stuff. I nonetheless think that the gift of the magazine that I have is that I was given by the board to run, is that it's in its DNA. When it was founded in 1945, its purpose was to explain the Jewish people to America and to explain America to the Jews. This mission no longer is necessary. Jews don't need explaining to America, and Jews don't need America explained to them. They are in some ways the greatest of all beneficiaries of the American experiment among all minorities, all visitors to this country, all immigrants to this country, and in fact our readership is only half Jewish, whereas I think, probably 40 years ago it was 80% Jewish or 90% Jewish. And so what I think is that what is built in its DNA is this explanatory mission to try to portray the world as it is, not as we would like it to be. And that one of the great failings or sins of the liberal and progressive experiments, both in a negative and both in their positive expressions of how they think the world is and in their negative, is that they discard the world as it is, and they portray it as they wish it would be, as some kind of new progressive experiment in flattening and global citizenship and all of that, or as America as this high-bound racist country that that still is suffused with its original sin from which which predates even its very existence.
To the point of the passionate intensity that was poured into editing every word in commentary is a famous David Brooks line, right? That it wasn't until he wrote his 5th piece for commentary that he saw one of his own original sentences appear in commentary.
Now, I'm not like that as an editor. That's true. I'm not like that as an editor, I will say.
Let's take some questions. We've got a few microphones, and please just tell us your name and also make your question a question to the extent you can. Let's start in the back there.
Arnold Kling. What are your publications going to try to do to shape the post-Trump conservative movement?
Well, it sort of depends on when that is, that does matter enormously because I'll be nearing my retirement date I won't really be nearing if he wins the second term, but obviously a Republican Party that has Trump as a president for 8 years, as opposed to a Republican Party that had Trump as a president for 4 years, is going to be these are going to be vastly different institutions. One will have been rocked on its heels. The other will have been entirely transformed in ways that we can even now, even the project that Rusty is engaged in, you can't draw a straight line to the future and say, there'll be all these changes to the tax code to create more solidarity or whatever, could next 5 years could be horror, Trump could win and like as the case with other second terms could be absolutely horrendous, including in the issues that everybody in this room cares about. So there will be a lot of work to do if he loses and the question then is, can the right not immolate the way, I think a lot of us thought if Trump lost in 2016, he would refuse to accept the results of the election. There would be a kind of civil war in the party in which people like us who wrote for the against would be blamed, the way we still are sort of, although it's weird since he won, but that we would be blamed for his loss and they would come after us in whatever way they could or whatever. And I suppose that could happen. I think a loss would mean that he gave it his best shot and came up short, and people don't, if he likes a winner, it won't be good that he's a loser. And that will open up space for precisely the kind of conversation that you're talking about. But I don't think any of the terms will change. I mean, one of the things, not to monologize here, but when Rusty mentioned the thing about the academic institutions and taxing and all of that, one thing that is very clear and that has come clear over the last 6 months, largely through the unanticipated results of this Varsity Blues scandal, is the understanding that there is a deep sickness in the way the American elites, American elite pursues the educational and career opportunities for its own children. And these Harvard's $40 billion endowment, a judge just now saying it's perfectly okay for Harvard to discriminate against Asian Americans, despite the fact that it has it gets all this tax money from the government that supposedly makes it so that they should not be allowed to do that sort of thing. A lot of us have been sitting around for 30 or 40 years saying something's got to give here with the universities. Like, they cost too much, no one can afford them, people come out of them and they don't make the kind of money that they even used to, and it didn't cost, when I was in college, my last year of college, it cost tuition at the University of Chicago was $6,100, and it's now, that was 1982, it's now $60,000. And this can't go on. It can't go on, it can't go on, it can't go on, right? But their exogenous factors can really shatter this. And just as, and I think this stuff, and the fact that people really are horrified to see the lengths to which the panic that has seized the elites at the idea that their children might not get the advantages that they might get because of these accrediting institutions that assign them roles in the upper middle class simply by dint of having a diploma from them. Stuff is shaking out. Stuff is going to shake out. That's what I think. I don't know how it's going to work, but where we are now is not where we will be 10 years from now with a lot of the elite institutions, which are crumbling without anything coming to replace them. That's the problem. They're all crumbling, but we don't have any, we need something. We need structures of some kind.
Rich, what does National Review offer a post-Trump right?
Well, as John said, I mean, it matters a lot what post-Trump, what the circumstance is where we get to the post-Trump era. I think it'll be more vitriolic and divisive than it is now. I think the stakes will be huge. I think it'll be fascinating. I think the argument that consumes a lot of time, how bad is Trump, how bad is this tweet or this statement, or how good is it, or are you supporting him enough, opposing him too much, is kind of boring compared to the underlying debates that Rusty and others, Tucker Carlson, have brought to the fore. And I think those debates are more interesting and more heated in the absence of Trump than they are now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think what I want to promote in a conversation in the magazine is how to develop a politics of solidarity that fits with the traditions of the American right. And I want to remind my readers again and again that their religious faith relativizes these very intense political conflicts in our society, and that while they are very important, and we as citizens have our duty to take the stand that we think is right, it's not what matters ultimately.
Let's take another question. Please, up here.
Thank you. Armin Choksi. What explains the fact that conservatives have been so ineffective in influencing elite opinion makers? For example, academia is infested with left-wing professors that are brainwashing our children, and that's long-term, has very negative long-term effects. The financial elites have swung left. The media is predominantly left. Hollywood is left, but we know that they can't think. And then you've got the Silicon Valley that has gone left. Why is it that all these elite groups have swung left and the conservatives haven't been able to crack through?
Rich, solve this for us.
Yeah, thanks. Just as soon as I get the post-Trump figured out, I'll have an answer to this. Well, these are all institutions, especially the media and academia, with really hardwired internal cultures that are almost impossible to break. And the power of culture is extraordinary and very, very difficult to dissolve or loosen in the best circumstances. And it's just, I despair. I mean, we have, if you just look at the media, we've spent so much time and energy as a movement fact-checking the mainstream media, trying to shame the mainstream media, trying to do better or different reporting than the mainstream media, and the mainstream media is worse than ever. And I'm not sure what is going to change it unless these institutions, and maybe academia as an example, have some internal crisis that forces some sort of change. But I think it's sort of beyond our power to do it on our own.
The media have changed.
For the worse.
Well, they've changed for the worse, and they've changed entirely. I mean, revolutionized entirely. I'll give you a thought experiment. So it's 1973, 1974, and Nixon is president. And Nixon, of course, is in deep trouble. He has the Washington Post and the New York Times and a Democratic Congress going for his jugular. There's one guy living in the Kennedy Warren named Victor Lasky who writes a book called It Didn't Start with Watergate that makes the point, it sells 2 million copies, makes the point that he wasn't the first to tape people in the White House. Robert F. Kennedy was Attorney General for his brother and wiretapped half the country. And that everything that Nixon was accused of was something that his, including campaign finance violations and the behavior of his reelect and all of that, were things that his predecessors had done. And this was a sotto voce opinion Victor Lasky's book came out. Lucianne Goldberg was its agent. Came out, sold, no cultural impact whatsoever. Today, do you think that that would be the case? There is a Fox News channel to provide the counter narrative. There are blogs, there is this, there is that, there is Drudge, there is... Trump exists in a world that Nixon couldn't even have imagined, in which he has a force of, he's got this, sort of force of defenders behind him who can make a lot of noise and have some effect on the debate in a way that Nixon, this is not a defense of Nixon, I'm glad Nixon resigned from office, but the entire ecosystem of American politics and the role of the media in American politics is so wildly different. There were 4 gatekeepers in the 90s. There was the New York Times, Washington Post, CBS News, and that's about it. Like everybody else was playing catch up, and they had no, they had no oomph. It was Lyndon Johnson decided not to run for re-election for president because Walter Cronkite said that we'd lost at Tet, which we hadn't, by the way. But imagine that now. You think Obama would not have run again if, I don't know, Brian Williams had said that, he lost Syria? I mean, it's unimaginable.
Yeah, to follow up on John's point, we live in a paradoxical moment, which is that it feels as though we're in a kind of quasi-totalitarian society where all of these mainstream institutions are controlled by the left. And they can impose speech codes, and they can professionally assassinate people on the one hand. On the other hand, they can't control national elections. Which was, as you pointed out, John, the gatekeepers could control national elections. They could, say...
Well, they could take... Nixon got 62% of the vote in 1972, and he was gone... in 18 months.
I think that's a sign that actually the left is my experience, my friends on the left, is they feel as much under assault as people on the right do.
Does that mean that little magazines like these actually matter more than they used to because they can be backed by people on Twitter and on Fox and elsewhere and actually infiltrate the political conversation in a way that they just wouldn't have made waves 40 years ago?
Yeah, it's hard to say, people often ask me, how do you influence people? I don't know. It's a mystery. I mean, here I think John's skepticism and modesty is absolutely correct. It's very mysterious as to why an article winds up really, I mean, you have some sense of things you think are important, but some really pop. And it's very mysterious to know why that's the case.
I will say this. Take 50 years, 80 years of Time magazine. Time I worked as my first job in journalism. 4 million readers a week, right? Commentary then, probably 35,000, okay? There are 10 articles that ran in commentary from, say, 1972 to like 1986 that a certain type of person will remember forever. There is one article that ran in Time magazine for the last 80 years that anybody remembers, and that was Charles Krauthammer's Reagan Doctrine. One article that was the most successful news magazine publication in American history, and it was fish wrap. I mean, that's the difference. We're sticky. I don't know whatever that ridiculous term is. I mean, we're
timeless.
What we do at our best is, what is that great line that Keynes had? Every politician is the robot of some defunct economist.
Philosopher in his study, yeah.
Yeah, so the idea, people are influenced by people like us without ever knowing it. That's
how good we are.
That's right. But I mean, that's the
And it's
truth.
not even a conspiracy.
But that is right. That is the truth of it. Is that I mean, how many people read Losing Ground? I mean, how many people read Charles Murray's original piece that was the source of Losing Ground? And when that stuff came out, the idea that we would end welfare 10 years later, that was science fictional. The notion that we would not have a lifetime kind of welfare benefit in the United States, it was just like an interesting intellectual exercise, except that it penetrated and got into people's heads.
Well, that, rather than Rich's despair, is surely the place to end. It is 6:45, which is our time. So thank the three of you very much, and thank all of you for coming.
Thanks, Yuval. That was great. Good job, John. Good job.
All right, good, thanks.
Rich, are you running off?
Yeah, I have an 8 o'clock train I got to catch.